Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Beyond the Donation. I am joined by my co-host, Noah Barnett. Noah, how are you today?
I am doing well. You know, it was a holiday weekend. We had a long weekend, got to spend time outside, get some sun. So grateful for that.
Yeah, we've got a touch of fall weather here up in Fargo, so it's about 60 degrees outside today, which feels fantastic. So I'm enjoying the last couple of days of a little cooler weather, to be honest.
Yeah, I was talking to someone earlier from the team who's up north, and they're like, oh, it's like sweater weather.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I was like, it's like sweating weather still here in Arizona. So very different.
We'll likely not feel this way come about mid-December, though. We'll long for the 80-degree days. But I'm super excited for our topic today. We're going to really dig into and talk a little bit about different kinds of metrics within a nonprofit and maybe some of the pitfalls that we see around things like vanity metrics. And then what are some of the metrics that you should be looking at as a nonprofit when you're trying to make decisions? So I'm excited about this.
Yeah, and it's definitely a hot topic because I think a lot of times when we talk with customers and or nonprofit teams, especially smaller teams, they bring this up, oh, I need to report on this, or how would I be able to know if this happened? Or my board always asks for, this gymnastics report where you bend over backwards and you divide by 2 and then you add 3. And it's like, I'm not sure how to do all of these different things. And then then you go out to the industry experts and they're like, you should be tracking this. 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 And it can be quite overwhelming. And so as part of this new commitment to help lean teams really rethink how they approach their work, last week being a lot about productivity and prioritization. So if you're interested in that and you haven't listened to episode 2, definitely go back to that one. But today is, how do I actually know and measure whether what I'm doing is actually making an impact on my organization?
Yeah, and you're right. We hear it all the time. Hey, I have to track X, Y, and Z number. It's like, why do you have to track that? Well, because that's what I heard on this webinar that I was on, that I should be tracking. And there really is. And this isn't just, I think it's important to say, like, this is not just unique to nonprofits. Like this, I think this happens across the entire business world of these vanity metrics, and they're metrics that they might give you a warm fuzzy or make you feel good. But at the end of the day, what are they really telling you? And are they really helping you make good decisions as a business leader, as an organization leader? And I think we fall into that trap really, really easily. Maybe to kind of kick us off here, like when we talk about vanity metrics, like, what are some of the things that come to mind for you? I know I've got a few in my head. They're probably similar to ones that you're thinking of too, but like, what are some of the things that, to help our listeners kind of understand what we mean when we say a vanity metric? Give us some examples.
Yeah, I think anything that's like a large number. And what I mean by this is, like, we love numbers that grow year over year. So it's like, we had 100 people come to our event. We had 94 people open our emails, or we had 10,000 people come to our website. And it's like, when you're leaning on the weight of the number in of itself as impressive, often that can be a clear indicator that it may be a vanity metric. And I think you did a great job of defining what a vanity metric is as a number that looks good and feels good, but doesn't really tell you anything, or doesn't really kind of help you understand things. But I do think explaining the opposite really quickly might be helpful. Is like, what does a good metric actually mean? It's not about email open rates or numbers of events or social followers, because those aren't necessarily actionable. And so that's where I would kind of start, is like, when you're thinking about metrics, when I look at it, I should be then able to interpret what I should do about it next, or be able to kind of respond to that metric and be able to say, okay, that's indicating that we are either doing a good job in A, B, and C area because we've seen an improvement, or if we need to move that number forward, we are going to do A, B, and C actions in the next period of time to be able to move that forward. Are there other aspects to you of what are the qualities of a good metric versus a vanity one?
I agree with what you said. First of all, when I think about it, it's like, what are the metrics that actually help inform me as I'm trying to define my strategy of what I'm going to go do, and that help inform me on the actions to take. And then I think within that, there's really like two kind of primary types of metrics that we might be looking at. There's going to be like your leading indicators, and then there's going to be your trailing indicators. And so when I think about like leading indicators, these are things that are helping me predict what's going to happen. So example there would be like, we know that if we are consistent in our engagement activities with our constituents and our stewardship activities, that will lead down the road to X, Y, Z results. So one of our leading indicators is, are we doing the activities that we're supposed to be doing as it relates to the stewardship and so forth? But then a trailing indicator is going to help.
I want to add, because I do think it's simplifies really quick. Like one of our things is, and we've kind of dumbed it down, but I think it's helpful. How many people are we talking with? Like we can't, bring on new customers in our case for DonorDoc, or you can't raise more donors or capture more major donors if you're just not talking to more of that. And so even though it is a more quality to the metric, it's just a leading indicator. Like if I talked to 6 last week and I got a result, it's like, oh, if I talk to 12 this week, does it keep going incrementally, right?
There's that old formula, like the 10-3-1, it's like every 10 people
I'm not familiar with this. Okay. Yeah.
So it's like every 10 people that I talk to, I'm going to have a follow-up conversation with 3 of those, and one of those may turn into like whether it's a new donor or a sales deal or whatever that is. And so you can start to work backwards from that and say, if I want to get 20 new donors in over the next quarter, then I need to have follow-up conversations with 60 people. And that means I need to talk to, 600, whatever that number is. And so it just kind of helps you work back. But the idea is that you're trying to create predictability, and then these become the leading indicators, the metrics that tell you or predict that you're going to achieve that result because you're doing those things on a consistent basis.
Yeah. And what's the next type of metric? You were kind of alluding to a second.
So then it's like the trailing metrics. That's the metric that after the fact, you look back and it proves whether you did it or you didn't do it. So the trailing indicator would be how much, growth in our donor revenue over a period of time, but we're looking back versus looking forward. And so it's like the difference between predicting and proving. And so I think those actionable metrics are important, things that come to mind, like donor retention rate, for example, that would be a good indicator of a trailing metric because I'm looking back at a period that's already happened to see what my retention rate looks like. Cost per dollar raised, lots of different things like that where they help inform you of what's, it actually goes back to something we talked about last week. It's like you have to know what's working so that you can focus your time and energy on the things that are working. And if you have the right metrics, it's actually going to tell you what's working and help inform you there. If you have vanity metrics and that's what you're focused on, it's not going to help you know what's working. In fact, it's the opposite. And now you're right back where we talked about last week, where it's like, I don't know what's working, so I don't know what to spend more time on. And I think that's why this is so important, to be honest.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if we use the same kind of tool that we used last week when that happens, was to say, hey, let's take everything off the table and let's only bring back things that we have kind of validated that they're worthwhile to track. Because you might have a spreadsheet or a slide or some sort of reporting mechanism that you've been reporting on for years. And maybe you inherited it, right? And it's hard to then say, let me add more things or let me go explore some of these things that Matt, you just recommended. Because I still have to do these other things. And I think giving ourselves permission to be like, I'm not sure why we're tracking this. And so I'm going to get curious with that. But I also might just need to set that to the side for a minute because I know we should be tracking this and I'm going to go track that. I'm going to go track that down because that would then inform where my team invests their time in the future or where I invest my time in the future.
And one thing that I think is really an interesting approach, and again, we're talking about how do lean small teams operate like this. And one of the things that we've implemented that I think has been really, really helpful is across the business, every person has a key metric that in our case, they're typically we try to make them leading indicator metrics. And we get together as a team every week on Monday and we review. Every person shares where they are against that metric and the goal that they have against that metric for the week prior. And it creates a rhythm not only of accountability, but also of visibility within the organization. When you're a small, lean team, like trying to break down silos and break down walls and like having a lot of open, collaboration and things can be really, really helpful and really, really powerful. And so, that's one thing that I think small fundraising teams could kind of operate in a similar fashion, where our person leading marketing, what's the most important metric that we all want to know how we're doing against, that they can share with us on a weekly basis? And then you do that for each person in the team. And that's not to say that each person only has one metric they're responsible for, but identifying what is that most important metric that each person is responsible for can really create a lot of clarity within an organization as to what is most important that you're working on each week.
Yeah, absolutely. And it also gives you shared language within the team or even for yourself to say, I'm working on this because I believe, and maybe you're not sure, it's okay. You can have a hypothesis. We do the same thing, which is I believe that this will move my metric forward, whatever that metric is. And so let's like kind of unpack an example, because I think we want to keep this really practical. But it's like, if I know that I'm trying to improve donor retention rates, like that's a bigger thing that we know, like our donor retention rate isn't where it needs to be. And we would really like to see a big improvement there, because we're seeing a lot of new donors come in, but we're not necessarily seeing great retention there. That would be kind of like a big strategic metric where you're like, hey, this is a strategy. We've identified an opportunity for us. We're going to double down on that. Now, if you just take donor retention rate and plop it on your weekly report, again, that's not really telling you anything to do or how well what you did this week is actually moving that forward. And so in that example, Matt, what do you think we would recommend that fundraiser or that fundraising team focus on as a leading indicator if they're trying to improve donor retention rates?
Yeah, really good question. And I think it goes back to, again, the difference between leading and trailing. So the ultimate goal is we want to increase donor retention. That's a trailing indicator. We're not seeing a big change in that big number on a week to week basis. So we actually need to take and say, what are the things or the activities that we can do on a weekly basis that we believe will improve that number over the next 3 months or 6 months or whatever that time frame looks like? And so if you're getting very practical about it, then you're probably looking at it and saying, if our retention rate isn't where we want, it's probably because we aren't stewarding our donors or engaging with our donors in the way they expect to be engaged with. And so maybe a very practical thing that you could look at as a leading indicator of success around donor retention is, how many donors on a weekly basis am I connecting with at a personal level? And maybe you've created some metric around that where it's like, we know to be successful, we need to each connect with 25 donors on a personal level each week. That's just an example. There's no scientific, I'm not saying go do 25. It all depends on what does the donor base look like and so many different things. Or maybe if you're using a system like DonorDoc, and you're able to take advantage of like our journeys and our action board, which are designed to help guide you through that donor stewardship process to lead to better retention. Maybe your metric is around, I've completed 90% of my journey activities last week. And you have a certain goal around, everyone needs to complete 90+% on a weekly basis of the journey nudges that have been, put on your action board. And really what that means for people who aren't DonorDoc customers, the action board is kind of like, it's not like a dashboard in the sense of like what you would think of as a dashboard. What it is a hub for driving the right activity. So it surfaces nudges on a daily basis of the things that need to get done to continue to build the best donor relationships possible. And that spans everything from, very reactive things like a donor gave their first gift all the way through, journeys that sometimes last months with multiple touch points in there. But the whole idea behind that is to kind of take this approach of, I have to go read a report or look at a dashboard to try and figure out what I need to go do next. And we're turning that on its head and saying, no, the system's going to tell you what to do next. And now your job is to take that action. And those are basically doing the things that are the leading indicators of success in the long run. And so, that's how I would break it down, is we're trying to increase donor retention. We know that better donor engagement on an ongoing basis with existing donors is a path to get there. So now let's break it down into something that we're all agreeing that we're going to do on a weekly basis, and we're accountable to that. And that becomes that leading indicator or that metric that we are tracking to on a weekly basis.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what I've found successful when I was leading fundraising, even just related to this, now we're getting more tactical, but I think it relates to metrics, is ensuring that every donor that I want to retain has a touch point that's both net positive, that thanks them, and that reinforces the impact of our work every single quarter. And so we could basically track, like, when was the last time these donors got a touch point with us, and how do we reduce that to zero, basically, like that there's zero donors that haven't received a, what I would call, grateful and impactful touch point. So there's gratitude embedded into it, and you're reinforcing care for the cause and kind of reminding them of why they're choosing your organization as a conduit to make that impact. So that kind of grateful, impactful touch point every quarter. And basically what you can do is, which is kind of ironic, it's actually the opposite of a big number, is you want to drive that number to zero. So you're like, there's zero donors that have not had a grateful and impactful touch point in the last 3 months. Because we believe in that case, and I saw this practically, that if that was true, if we could get it to zero, we would increase the number of donors that we were able to retain year over year. And ultimately, that then led to increased fundraising, because what ended up happening too is that we not only retain the donor and the donor's gifts, but we actually saw a net positive impact to the retained gifts, because we were just doing that and monitoring that. And so we decided that that was important. And the reason I flesh that out a little bit further is because everyone listening to this needs to raise more money, most likely. And if you're listening to this and you don't need to raise more money, you probably are still trying to raise as much money as you did before, or you're trying to still hit a fundraising goal of some sort. And thus, we have to break that down almost like a nesting doll to figure out, like, where are the practical ways that I can actually impact that? And that's where some of these leading indicators come into play, which is, I want to raise more money. Part of raising more money is retaining my donors' gifts. Part of that is actually retaining donors, because you can't retain their gifts if you don't retain them. They're humans. And then to do that, we need to have net positive connections with them. Okay, well, if we want to do that, what do we need to do here? Let's track that on a weekly or monthly basis and drive that forward.
And you can easily, say you got 300 donors that you're trying to retain, and you need to touch base with each of them quarterly. You can kind of work backwards to say, that means every week, here's a solid number every week that we need to have a connection with. So it's not just based on guessing. I always say, I think, I hope, I feel is not a strategy for running a nonprofit. But yet it's a strategy that I think a lot of nonprofit leaders sometimes kind of default to. And like, this becomes very, very tactical, very attainable. We have a finite number of people we need to talk to. We have a finite amount of time in which we need to do that. How does that break down? And then let's be accountable to making sure we do that. And it's interesting, because if you look at, we mentioned the journeys that we have in DonorDoc, like, so many of those have touch points every 3 months. It's not by accident. They're built in to make sure that kind of quarterly check-in at a minimum is happening. And if you don't have a tool like that, use whatever tool you have and build reports to say, show me all of the donors whose last touch point was more than 3 months ago. And that's like, there's a very actionable list for you to work on, over the next period of time. And you can kind of continue to kind of do that on a regular basis. Sometimes there's so many silver, shiny objects out there, and like we're always trying to find like the silver bullet of the easy button of everything. But sometimes it's just about doing the fundamentals and then doing the fundamentals well, and like thanking donors well and connecting with them on a regular basis. That's a very fundamental thing to fundraising, but sometimes it's not. Oftentimes it's not happening at that level that it should be. And I think this is just a practical way to try and ensure that it does.
Yeah, for sure. And I think like I'll bring up another example that I think is it really important. And maybe it's opening a can of worms for a future episode, Matt, but I do think it's really significant. Is often we meet with leaders who say, let's say it's, hey, I want to raise more money and I want to convert more gifts. And we're like, okay, great. Like, how are you thinking about approaching that? And we just talked about one strategy, which is, hey, we want to retain more donors and retain more gifts, and maybe actually get those donors to give more next year. And that's going to be part of my growth strategy. But a big part of growth is actually turning like non-donors or people that you don't even know yet into donors. And it's like, yeah, we really need to do that. We definitely need to do that. Okay, so how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to send an email a month and we're going to do this event and we're going to do that. How is that different than last year? No, these are things we do every single year. And like, this event's coming up. It's extremely busy. We have to get down the weeds, and like, we only have time to write one email and like this, that, and the other. And so what happens is our to-do list gets built disconnected from our objectives.
Mm-hmm.
And what we're suggesting here with the weekly check-in at the minimum, but maybe it's even a bi-weekly check-in or a Monday meeting and a Thursday meeting, depending on what cadence you want to have, is trying to keep you in check with the things I did this week need to align to the things that I'm trying to impact, which does take slowing down and saying, okay, what am I trying to do? What is the behavior I need to do to influence that? And then how do I make sure I build my to-do list from there? Mm-hmm. Or with the help of something like DonorDoc, that's going to always remind you every day what you want to focus on because it's the most important versus what's urgent. And I think this is where like metrics come into play so frequently, is it's not an afterthought. It's actually something that you should start with to then drive your to-do list. Because if every time you send an email, you get 5 new donors and you're only sending 1 email a month, like you shouldn't expect more than, 60 new donors from your email program. And if your event's with all current donors, then like, how are you going to get to 300 new donors if that's your new goal, if that's all you can do? Mm-hmm. You've actually designed a path that will not get you to where you need to go. It's like, hey, I'm trying to get to Florida and like, I only like have enough gas to get to North Carolina, from Virginia or something like that. Like I've literally not even allowed myself to be successful. And I think that's where the vanity metrics of like, hey, look, we're trying to go after this, we're trying to go after this, can be a substitute for substance towards your goals. And I think if you actually strip some of that away and get extremely practical on what am I doing today, this week, to move the needle on Y, because Y is going to make an impact on X, is extremely empowering. Because again, like we said last week, and I'll just kind of keep iterating it because it keeps coming up even when we talk to nonprofits this week, which is, I'm too busy, I'm too busy, I'm too busy. I'm trying to be efficient. Like we have no money, we have no resources, like we're trying to grow, the tax for my time is so significant. And it all comes back to like your time and your energy. And so we have to almost treat that like a precious like stone of some sort. And these tactics between last week's episode, if you haven't listened to it, please go back and listen to it. I think it's extremely helpful around prioritization. Plus this week's episode starts building this path for you to free yourself from busy and more, and really focus on like impact, the thing that are most impactful. Like I think more is actually the enemy, because I think more is a false path towards efficiency. Yep. When really it's about most impactful versus more. There's a real
like simple analogy between more and vanity metrics versus the most important things and like the right actionable metrics, if you really think about it. And one thing that I just want to say too, going back to the idea of like the Monday conversation, and you use the word empower, the other thing that does is that empowers your team to push back when they're asked to do things that maybe don't drive towards the things that we've all agreed are the most important things to get done. Through what we've seen with our team is that there's a lot of things that might take us away from what we've been told or we agree is the most important thing we should be focused on. And it gives you the ability to respectfully push back on some of that sometimes and say, wait a second, you're asking me today to go spend a bunch of time doing this, but that doesn't drive what we agreed was the most important thing you want me to focus on. Now, you may say, in this scenario, we're going to do that anyway, but at least it allows for that conversation. And I think sometimes that can get you where that can put you in a position where you're like, you know what? You're right. That actually isn't important. And I don't let me distract you from the thing that we've agreed you need to be doing. And so I think there's some level of that where having that rhythm or that cadence where we're looking at these things together creates that empowerment to everyone to be pretty clear on what is the most important thing or the most important things. So I actually really love that. But I do think there's like this really strong analogy between like the most important things and the actionable metrics and then the vanity metrics and just getting more done. It's like they're both vanity metrics and just getting more done are for the sake of feeling good, checking the box, but it doesn't necessarily move the organization forward.
Yeah. And seems like so pragmatic, but it's like what feels good isn't necessarily good.
Yeah. I find myself still, Noah, like where if things get stressful or they get hectic or whatever within the business, that I will at times kind of retreat to the things that I'm able to check a box off. For me, that means going into the product and working on a task in the product that I can check off and say, I got that done this week, because it feels good to feel like I took control of something when things sometimes feel a little bit out of control. I don't know if you ever find yourself I think that's a human nature thing to some degree, but
yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. Again, we all need these little wins, right? Yeah. And I think like it's fine to need those little wins. And when you find yourself in those, this goes back to, I think, the last episode we did where it's like, like I just did that and it felt good. Or like, man, this week I've done a lot of things and like I feel good, but like, were those really necessary? And like, you don't have to be critical of them. It's just like that awareness. It was the ACT technique we talked about, which is like, there's an awareness of like, oh, that happened. That's interesting. And then be curious, like, why did I go in and ship a new feature when maybe I was supposed to be doing A, B, and C instead? Or why did I just pick up the phone and call our customers because instead of like trying to advise the team on how to maybe do that? And like, none of those things are good or bad. It's just a matter of learning through that to say, what are we trying to accomplish and what are we trying to anchor to? And I think what we realized and why we wanted to talk about metrics today is we talked last about priorities, but priorities cannot be disconnected from your targets or your metrics. And I think what I want to do is almost like provide a little like teaser for the next one, because one thing that I worked a lot with nonprofits on when I was doing consulting was what I called the growth pot, POT. And we basically said, hey, we're going to build a growth pot and we're going to help, like, this is how we're going to drive growth within your organization. And it was basically this idea of like, what are we trying to do? Like, what is our growth overall strategy, vision, how we're going to grow? And P was for priorities and T was for targets. But I think we need to come back and talk about O. And what O stands for is omissions. Things we acknowledge we could do that we are intentionally not going to do. Because just as important as it is to prioritize what you are going to do and why you're doing that, sometimes it's really, really important to be explicit on like, we could do more events, but we've decided that that's not the most important thing. And so we are clearly putting it on here. So then when someone gets a bright idea on a Tuesday morning and was like, why aren't we doing more events? It's like, no, that's a great idea. We thought about that, but it's on the omission list. So I think we should come back and think about like, how do you actually practically like bring this together, maybe in like a framework that allows you to have kind of a clear, almost like playmat that says, okay, here's our priorities, here's our targets, and here's what we're not going to do. And so we should come back and talk about that next time, Matt.
Yeah, I like that. I think that'll be a great conversation. I know we like to kind of try and provide a piece of advice before we kind of sign off today. So as it relates to the topic we've been talking about today around, metrics, if you could give our listeners kind of one piece of advice or one takeaway, what would that be from you?
Eesh, that's a tough one. Now I'm trying to think tactically on like what is the simplest ones. I think last week I really focused on the idea of just like being aware, like take a week and not like try to implement anything you heard today, but just be aware of it. I think what I would suggest for this week is to potentially look at maybe what you measure on a monthly basis and just ask yourself the question. There's this whole concept of like, there's like adult me and child me, and you can like sit down and have this like parental conversation with yourself where you're like, let the adult ask the question or the teacher or the guide or whatever, and like write that down and then like answer it just organically. Like you're not, no one's watching or judging you. It's just like, why are we doing this? Like just kind of spill it all out. And so I think just kind of doing that exercise of, hey, we're measuring the number of people that are on our email list. Why does that matter? Like, why, like, and actually just go through and like answer that question. Like, oh, we're measuring it because of A, B, and C, or we assume A, B, and, Y, or like, I always get asked by the board president, how many people are on our email list? And like, maybe I just need to be honest with that. Or website visitors, right? I always ask my teammates how many visitors we have to our website. Like, why am I asking that question? What am I really trying to understand? What am I trying to learn or instill in that other person by asking that question? And kind of just doing this exercise of like, this kind of like big you, little you kind of mentoring program with yourself around what metrics are on your dashboard.
Yeah, I like that. I think my piece of advice would be just to try and simplify things. It doesn't do you any good to have 50 metrics that you're trying to measure and report on and so forth. So, try and simplify down, find the most important 5 metrics, for example, that you want to measure across your fundraising efforts, and then do that well. And I think, challenge the status quo of like, we measure this because that's what I heard on a podcast that I should be measuring.
This podcast specifically.
Great.
Thank goodness. This is great though. This is a really important topic. And I think like if you have feedback or questions and you're listening to this, add it to the notes, like, or the comment section. Or if you're watching this on YouTube, which hopefully you are, first subscribe so you get updates on when, we put out new content. But 2, just like put what you're thinking. Hey, I was measuring this and I really think I should be measuring this instead. We'd love to see your comments and kind of surface that back up. This is intended to be a conversation, not just between Matt and I, but us and you. And together we'll kind of figure this all out.
Yeah, that sounds great. And make sure to join us next time when we talk about pot on Beyond the Donation.
Yes, that's a great hook. We're going to use that to promote the episode.
Sounds good. Noah, thank you so much. This has been great. And looking forward to our next conversation next week.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.